Welcome to Dropping Your Armour, where we listen to stories from thinkers, doers, dreamers in the hope of unlocking our infinite human potential. My name is Tolga, and I'm an executive consultant at A-Train. And today I'm joined by Dinesh Saparamadu, the founder of the hSenid group of companies. Dinesh is a serial entrepreneur who has built multiple companies over the years. And for sure, while the companies have a focus on generating profits, I hope throughout the conversation you will hear how they never lost the focus of the greater purpose, which is helping others to develop their full potential in creating positive societal change. While I had a blast catching up with Dinesh, who I worked with in 2007 and a few years onwards, and we for sure will be sharing some personal anecdotes of moments that we shared together over the years. I hope you will be able to take away some insights and inspirations from our exploration of how leaders at hSenid had to adopt different leadership styles based on the organizational needs which were arising at the time, and how hSenid puts a human in the center while taking difficult decisions in times of crisis in 2008. Hey, welcome, Dinesh. Very nice to connect with you. Um, I just wanted to quickly check in with you that we've worked together many moons ago. I was trying to
Yes.
remember 2007 I started, and it
Wow.
was a quite a funny story for me. Do you still remember how I ended up at Senate?
Yeah, I think I can't remember exact details, Tolga, but I think yeah, you were kind of hanging out in Sri Lanka, and then you wanted to kind of look for some corporate work, and that's how we connected, right?
Slightly. It's interesting. I look back at it and I remember I actually was still in the UK at the time when we connected because I was going to move to Sri Lanka and I
Yes.
still had to write my master's thesis. And I was looking at organizational change and resilience. And I have reached out to you and said, hey, Dinesh, I'm going to be in Sri Lanka. Would you be interested in collaborating? And you said, absolutely. Why don't we connect once you're in Sri Lanka? And I started
That's
sweating
right.
because
That's right.
my master's degree, Jesus, had to be in about 3 weeks after I arrived in Sri Lanka. I
Yeah, yeah,
remember
no,
us.
no. 100%, 100%. I remember that, and your wife was joining the embassy here, and you wanted to kind of look at and do something. I think that was the whole point, right?
Exactly. And I remember meeting you in your office and us having a conversation. You said, absolutely, I'm full in support. You've got all access to the whole organization. And go ahead. And I think about a week after I had started, you said, "Hey, Tolga, have you ever thought about joining us as HR manager?"
Yes,
and that
yeah, yeah, that was a conversation, and that's the beginning of a long relationship. That was really great.
and I think for me that very much represents you to a certain degree, which is we had in-depth conversations and we had some philosophical conversations. At the same time, uh, you took a risk, right? You didn't know me that well, but you took a risk. You believed, based on the conversations we had, that this would be a good match. And I think that, to a certain degree, represents a little bit what I know of you, which is a risk taker, nevertheless a thoughtful thinker who thinks things through. And maybe rather than me trying to summarize your story, Dinesh, tell us a little bit about your story. Serial entrepreneur, tell me, where did this
Yes.
come from?
Yeah, so I think for me, just to give you a little bit of background, right? So I actually did my education in Sri Lanka, and then I was kind of looking to go to university, but I didn't get a chance to go to the Sri Lankan university. So, but I applied for some of the US universities, and I was selected in the Northeast. I actually studied in Connecticut. I went in, I actually did my bachelor's, and then I started working also while I was actually just after finishing my bachelor's as computer engineering. And then did my bachelor's, then I did my master's, then decided to that I just got married. I came back and my same time I actually my fiance that time actually went to a Sri Lankan university, whereas I went to US and we came back and we got married and decided to go back to US. We were there for about 3.5 years after that. So in total, I've been in US for about 10 years at that time. Then we were having our first child, and we decided actually we want to go back to Sri Lanka to have our first child. So that was the decision. This was in 1996, and we came back, and our daughter was born in December 1996. Then I started hSenid in 1997 April. So we are just over 26 years
Wow.
in yeah, it's been a great ride. We come into more detail. So at that point I was looking at what do I want to do, and the opportunity actually presented because I was at one of the Rotary meetings, where the speaker for that was from a from a gas company that was recently privatized, and Shell has taken over. Shell Gas was actually there, so he was the head of human resources at Shell. So after the his speech, when I spoke to him, I said, and his name is Jules Cronin, and to this date, I think I took a risk on recruiting people. He took a risk on kind of giving an HR system, and he asked me, "Have you done?" I said, "No, we have not done HR systems, but I had access in the sense I have worked on HR systems when I was working in US. So I said I had a pretty good understanding of what we were going to do, but it was very different because the local scenario was very different from where you actually had worked. So we built an HR system for Shell. That was our first customer. Then that was around 98 time frame where the Y2K, the millennium bug was coming in 2000. So everybody was changing their system. So HR payroll was a hot topic at that point. So we started with 3 employees when we were actually starting at that point. This was in 1997, 3 employees, and I had a apartment that was actually given rent free from my mother for a period, and I think I started paying rent maybe after about 2 years or so. And that was the beginning of Senate. Starting the two, and now we have about 7 companies, and Senate Business Solutions actually went public in 2021 December, and actually listed in the Colombo Stock Exchange as the first enterprise IT company to be listed in Colombo Stock Exchange. I had a very supportive family when I started hSenid. And like any company, that it's not easy to start a company. And we had multiple years of, we really didn't know how to pay the salaries, so we had to kind of use your personal money, or, borrow it and, do that, so that was the early stage. But I think that gave us this whole thing about even today, we are over maybe almost 1,000 employees, and we're in about 45 countries. That still being very frugal, being very cautious, I think is something that a lesson that I learned very early stage, and even for today, I still kind of practice that, continue that.
Which is interesting. You say very frugal. That's not really how I experienced you in the years that I've worked with you. Humble, I would have said yes. Frugal, not necessarily. I actually, like I said, always saw you a little bit more as a risk taker and someone who worked through his team. And maybe one thing to dive deeper on is the aspect of, you mentioned how you started out with hSenid Business Solutions, which it eventually became, right? Initially more focused on HRIS, and then, if I remember correctly, the product portfolio expanded. So hSenid Business Solutions, then the expansion or drift out into the mobile solutions came. And I remember working in both of those organizations. I think my offices were about a 10-minute walk across this beautiful lake, if I remember correctly, always in a very bloody hot summer
Yes.
heat. I remember walking and arriving in the office sweating like a pig. Beautiful location, nevertheless. And I think one of the things which, if I reflect back to the time when I was working with you, and at this time, both of the companies were well established, but the thing which I noticed that was that you had a very different leadership approach in both of those organizations. Were you aware of that difference yourself as well?
Yes, yes, definitely. Because what was happening, well, let me go back before when I talk about being frugal, let explain what it is. The frugal means that we actually um, spend on things that you need to spend, but also you are kind of have a overall picture of being humble, being looking at things that I know. So we never did things that was out of our kind of what I would call go out and try and be able to show and this like that. No, we were very very kind of sure. And even if I'm sure you met with most of them at that time, they also had a similar. So we were attracting people of the same culture. So if you
Hmm.
really look at us, if you ask me whether I had two different management styles for the two different companies, 100%, 100%. Because the reason was that hSenid Business Solutions, which was actually that time, and still, Sampath, at that time he was the general manager. Now he is the CEO of the company. When he was kind of my manager, I knew that he was able to kind of run the ship. So he knew, the team. He would work with them and stuff like that, and I had 100% confident in that where he would do that. And my role there was more of like I would say more of a mentoring or more of a kind of a giving directions, not really managing day to day, because day to day management was done by Sampath and his management team. So my involvement was there. You take hSenid Mobile Solutions, which is the telco one. I needed more hands on, so I kind of more hands-on work with them, but again empowering them. But I was always very mindful of how we need to kind of empower them, but at the same time, because it was a very fast moving, both industries were fast moving, but the mobile was even faster because of the technology changes. So the way that you have to kind of give directions was very different from the two. You're 100% correct.
It's interesting. So it very much speaks about this situational leadership awareness, which you demonstrated in those days, right? Whereas with Senate Business Solutions, it was really more that visionary and mentoring and coaching kind of approach that you used for the leadership team. Whereas in the mobile solution, I would still say you had a lot of that visionary perspective. I still remember us meeting in the boardroom after we had all read the book Blue Oceans, I believe it was at the time, right? Which we then utilized to set the strategy. At the same time, I would say it was very much of a unifying approach that you utilized, very hands on in the discussions, trying to draw out different ideas from the leadership team, as well as, if I remember correctly, we had at least a weekly, or if even not a bi weekly, town hall with the whole organization at the time, right?
Correct, correct. Yes. So the reason, again, they are like you mentioned, it was, we were actually looking at the different strategies, and Blue Ocean was one of the things because we needed to be different. This is especially with the mobile solutions. You can't be a me too and win in that, because you had to be innovating. Innovation was almost monthly, and because the technology was going from 2G to 3G, 4G, I mean, it was moving very fast. The consumer behavior was changing, so we had to be kind of a, you keep your eye to the, what's happening in the then your ear to what the consumers are telling you, right? So you actually need to kind of use that, and then get that feedback in a weekly, bi-weekly meetings, and say, okay, what do we need to do, how do we experiment and stuff. That's, and at the same time, right, I think you will remember, we were experimenting actually in going out. We started, like in 2004 was when we started our first outside operation, which was in Singapore, and we will be actually 20 years in Singapore for next year. It'll be 20 years. So since then, we were always looking at, we knew that the Sri Lankan market was a great experimental platform, but to scale that, we had to really kind of go out of the country. So that's something both companies, I mean, both hSenid Business Solutions, that are HR company, and hSenid Mobile Solutions, which is a mobile company, did that.
You were a forerunner, so to speak, in this whole agile philosophy of experimenting and failing on the small scale and failing fast, and then really utilizing that to scale at a much larger point. What gave you that courage, that belief that you, as a small, at the time still Sri Lankan company, could be a major player across Asia, predominantly, right? I know you operate outside of Asia, but Asia is probably the biggest
Yes,
market that
yes.
you're serving.
Correct, correct. Yeah. So to tell you the real truth, I think the real truth is, we really didn't know, and it was not a, it was not a. We really think about it, was not a grand strategy to do that. It was experimental by trying this out, and then okay, it worked. Okay, let's scale that, try that out. So if somebody said, okay, you had this, 3 to 5 year grand strategy. No, it was, we were working on maybe a 1 to 2 year plan, and but we
Mhm.
knew what was the. I think what I mentioned before is what is important for anybody, is that listening to your customers. So I used to meet with my customers every month when I used to travel to Singapore, or whether we go to Brunei, or Bangladesh or Philippines. I always met with my customers. Maybe not only the senior managers, but also people who are doing day to day, asking them, okay, how is it going? What are the challenges you're having? Then, and they used to tell me these are things. Then we would come back and say, okay, this is something, let's work on this particular feature. And then we say, okay, yeah, now you can do it much faster. So I think it's a very important part is to listen to your customers. You know the vision, but you listen to the customers. So that's how you will actually can bring what is really needed in the market.
It's interesting how you say that, right, Dinesh? Is you said we didn't have a 5, 10 year strategy. But what we did have, at least when I was there, and I'm sure you had it beforehand as well, was you had a purpose. You knew what you wanted to do. Then you had that customer intelligence, really tuning in and being customer centric in the solutions you develop, creating a culture which, however, enabled that constant experimentation, doing things fast, failing fast, learning and adapting, and then scaling the solutions, which I think if you looked at some of the textbooks of the modern organization, what agility looks like, that would be one of the definitions. One of the parts I would like to hone in on is that cultural element. You mentioned it before. You had a very inclusive, very learning orientated culture, which for me was very interesting when I joined hSenid, because when I joined hSenid, just so that as well our listeners understand the context, it was during the last 2 years of the Civil War, right? So 2007
Correct.
until 2009 is when the war ended. I can't remember exactly when it ended in 2009, but it was some of the most intense years of the war, correct?
Correct.
I, I,
Correct. Yeah.
I, I still remember living in the Hilton. And maybe just to sidetrack a little bit, we were living in the Hilton, and both sides, the Tamil Tigers and the Sri Lankan government, wanted to make sure that no Westerners or outsiders were harmed by the conflict, right? And a lot of the Westerners lived in the corporate Hilton apartments, and so when the Tamils flew their little chestnuts over to Colombo to throw some bombs, the Hilton would always put on the pool lights to showcase this is where the Westerners live. Don't bomb the bloody Hilton. And I remember standing outside on the pool going, like, it's really interesting how these tracer guns, because the anti-aircraft guns were shooting, right? And the tracer bullets, they were red. But when I grew up during the first Gulf War, and on the TV, all the tracer guns were always green because it was through the night vision. Anyhow, side story. The war was intensifying before it came to an end. One of the things which I thought extremely fascinating when I joined Senate was there was no differentiation between Tamils working at Senate, Sinhalese work, or quite frankly, any ethnicity or religious groups. They were all working together in harmony at Senate. How did you perceive that? How did you create that culture? I've got some ideas because as HR manager, I had some ideas around it. But from your perspective, what made the difference here?
Yeah. So I think it's interesting if you really look at the most of the businesses in Sri Lanka have no division at all. You take any of the companies, I mean, it's not unique to Senate. I won't take the credit for Senate because
Hmm.
any business in Sri Lanka, in my opinion, a lot of the divisions are created by political motives, not by, common people. And for us, we never saw anybody of, one ethnic group or one religion or anything like that. Everybody was a Sri Lankan. And when we recruit, I'm sure you because you were head of HR at that point. I mean, we never looked at even whether the person was any race. I don't think you would have ever had any form or anything that we would never even put, your race or anything like that because it's not needed, right? For us, I mean, even today, if you look at our companies, I mean, we recruit people for their skill and their competencies. From the beginning, actually, it happened, I think, maybe 4 5 years after we've been kind of been that we were growing rapidly. We were doubling every time, right? And then the way that we built the Senate culture, if you really look at, was that we actually did a culture diagnostic, right? We actually did a culture diagnostic. We want to say, okay, what are the elements, what are the things that people felt that we were unique? And we kind of build that as a consensus. And then we actually what we realized was we came up, I think I'll kind of talk about on the Senate mobile side, very similar thing with Senate Business Solutions. We said our customers were number one, so we had to actually talk about customer centric. Then we are really accountable for what we do. So we are accountability was one, and we always aspire to deliver excellence. So deliver excellence was one other thing. And then we are very passionate about what we do. Innovation cannot happen if you are not passionate about it. And then three other qualities we talk about. One was, as employees, learning and growth is paramount. So whether they learn and growth with their own organizations, and when somebody is leaving, I'm always asking one question is, are you going to a place that where you can grow better than being with Senate? If they say yes, I say, I'll be the first to kind of congratulate you for you to go into that. So it's very important. And the other one is integrity, and that's something we don't compromise at any cost, and we are not done for the last 27 years, and that's something that we will never compromise. And the last is the most, I think you mentioned some time back, is being humble. Humbleness is something that we always, the more you know, the more humble you must become. So those are the cultural values even today that we actually, I mean, we look at that seven cultural values as our kind of a core principles. When somebody comes, when there's a decision to be made, we look at those and we kind of go back to that, and that's our, I would say, kind of a decision making gauge. Kind of we all stand by that.
Mhm. So I think I would add another one, which is that true empowerment, which I guess is ultimately a driver as well for innovation. I do remember, and I want to connect it back to what you said. I do remember that when I came in, again, for one, I think you took a big risk in hiring me because while I had run my own consultancy before I joined hSenid, I had never worked in HR directly, and I had only studied HR, and here I was actually only finishing my master's degree, and then you gave me the leadership position in HR. But you allowed me to experiment. And one of those experiments was, for example, utilizing assessment centers during the hiring process. And funnily enough, I actually got a LinkedIn message from one of our former employees, Mafas Masen, who we hired as a sales rep at the time, and we had designed
Yes.
this whole day assessment center. And you just always said, "Absolutely, Tom. It sounds like a good idea. Whatever initiative I had, why don't you try it out on one small, experiment, and then we look how it works." And this was one of them, and he actually just wrote me a LinkedIn post a few days ago saying how much that assessment center influenced how he has approached his whole career going forwards. And I think that was something which really stood out for me, was that willingness to take the risk, experiment small, and then scale large. Um, and that willingness to put the human at the center. Which, Dinesh, I would like to go back to a time which was maybe a bit more challenging when we tried to put the human at the center, even at a challenging time. I think it was
2008.
2008 when the financial crisis hit.
That's right. That's right. Yeah. So that's at the time, and I think I really remember that. I think, Tolga, I think one thing that you mentioned was we can do two things. You said you can put your head under the sand and think that this storm will pass away, or we actually take it up and take the challenge and work with people, go through the challenging times. I think that's the time that we actually had to tighten our belts, really, and because it was kind of moving through us, right? And then we were kind of was really didn't know. I think it's very interesting. I think that kind of challenges when we went through really helped the senior management team. That most of them are still here, right? I mean, the people. I mean, most of our people that were that time are still here. Really helped them also to think about how to actually work through the pandemic. Pandemic was very similar to that, right? So we went through the and was different challenges, but still was going through the thing. And I think I remember very vividly that how we had to actually work with people, how we had to kind of look at. I mean, we had to do a hiring freeze at that time. We had to kind of look at, but it was not for too long. I mean, that was a good part. I mean, it just kind of maybe passed within a year or so. But yes, I mean, these are all ups and downs of a company, and as leaders, one of the most important things for us is to kind of how do we humanize most of this, and how do you think of people not as numbers? Because even this time, I think if you really think about, it's not the pandemic, then we have a really a financial crisis, that the inflations and all that. And what we have done is that we said, okay, and these points, employees comes first. So
Mhm.
we will take care of them. Yes, we will slow down or even cut some of our expansion plans, but we will actually take care of the employees, because I am a strong believer if you take care of your team, that the team takes care of the company in the long run.
And I think what stands out, or what I remember from that time in 2008, is like you said, initially that there was that big dialogue. We could see it coming, right? Because it came from the US and then swept through, and we were caught up in it. I remember us as a management team first sitting very late at night discussing how we were going to deal with it. And it was initially very much driven from the top. We then actually started, once we realized, yeah, we have to be proactive about this and we can't just wait and see what happens. We did bring in multiple voices from the organization. And if I remember correctly, well, we did have to ask people to resign. But if I remember correctly, I'm not sure I have the figures right. I think the biggest cuts we had to make at the time were in the business solution areas. What stands out for me on those are two elements. One was as a head of HR, I remember it was about a week period where we had to communicate to the people who we were going to let go, that we were going to let go. And people were literally hiding behind their desks when I walked into the office so that they didn't have to see me. I remember that we did it fast, we did it clean, we communicated openly what was happening, and most importantly, we looked together with those employees for alternatives. And if I remember correctly, don't quote me on the numbers, but I think it was 60 to 70% of the people that we did let go, we actually managed to position them with our customers to be some of the service
Yeah,
employees, which
yeah.
actually had a beneficial impact on sending business solutions in the long run, right?
Yeah, so we didn't really actually what we did was we actually realigned them, right? So some of them actually moved into other divisions, some of them went to our customers. So there was not really a kind of letting people go. We realigned them with different organizations that we did, because I think that's how some actually moved into Zenith Mobiles as PMs and stuff like that.
Exactly.
So we
True.
actually,
Yeah.
yeah, we were able to kind of do that.
But I think this idea of looking at what is the best solution, not only for the company, but for the people, what stood out for me is that remembrance of positioning them as a customer, which could have challenged the business one, right? Because ultimately we were supporting a lot of the customers from an external perspective. We then positioned employees with the customer, who then did some of the service agreements, which, however, created a lot of synergies between business solutions and our customers, because we had now people who understood both spectrums from a very positive perspective. So, what stands out for me there is what could be perceived as a risk and challenge, actually, in the long run, became a very strong business case of looking at supporting customers in a very different way.
100%. 100%. So actually, I think even to date, I think a lot of champions for all organizations are some of us are ex-employees or even customers who moved from a organization to an organization. They are the first to go and call us and say, Sampath or Dinesh, I'm at here, I'm head of HR here. I'm interested in the HR system that you guys did when I was in XYZ company. Same thing with employees. I mean, not only going to other companies, when they even migrate, when there are opportunities, they actually call and say, there's something like this, I can recommend you. Or the other thing is actually very interesting. I had actually call from a customer saying that, this in Singapore is saying that, okay, this guy is working for us. He's fantastic. Do you have anybody, more people like that we can actually work with you? So it's a, so we have created a kind of, I would say, a very interesting ecosystem for everybody, hSenid alumni to kind of be able to kind of engage and continue. Because one thing that I believe is that for most of the hSenidians, hSenid is your first job. So we get about 90%, maybe even, maybe 85 to 90% fresh graduates, right? So this is their first job. And when you get into your first job, you actually wants to kind of build them, grow them, and they will be moving on. They'll move within the organization or they move outside the organization. But as long as you can actually give them the right coaching, mentoring path that them to be successful in life, I believe that, that I personally, I believe that, we have actually created something bigger than what we are as an organization.
Now I want to shift to a slightly different area, Dinesh. It's always great to speak about all our successes, and we spoke a little bit about some of the challenging times, but let's speak about some of the biggest failures in your career as an entrepreneur and the lessons learned out of that.
Yeah, so not everything is rosy. Uh, I think, so you know, we start things, and we definitely kind of had a fair share of failures in what we have done. To start with, I think we were, wanted to kind of develop a new company in the area of animation, and we used to call it Mid Studio, because I saw that it was something that was there, and we had some very talented people. But this was pre cloud and all that stuff. But I very quickly learned was that, for you to be able to do that, you need a huge computing power for 3D rendering and all that stuff, where the country didn't have, we didn't have. So we ran that for about a year, and we decided, that was not the right thing to do. So that was, I would say, from a company failures. But we learned from that was that actually uh, it would have been good if we had done a little bit of more research before we jumping into it. So that whole thing about uh, do it, and then if it didn't work, close it down. Maybe that's the way it is. That's what, right?
And I love hearing that. I think one of the things which I enjoyed a lot when I was working with Senate, and it sounds like you've scaled that, is that belief that as a at the time still relatively small organization, we could have a positive impact on society. I still remember our opening of the office. The name I can't remember. You probably know the name. It was a. Remember that there was a university further north in the mountain area where we had
Yeah,
opened a
Candy.
small office in
Yeah,
Candy.
yeah, the
Exactly.
Candy. Yeah. Yes, yes.
And I remember the conversations we had in the management team if it even made sense to open an office there versus just asking students to come to Colombo to work. And the ultimate deciding factor was that while maybe from a business sense, it didn't make the most sense to have the office there, but in terms of creating an environment where studying engineering and technology would, you know, help the society and can to really understand the opportunities it creates was the deciding factor.
Correct,
And
correct. And
now,
then
and
actually, yeah,
go
part of
ahead.
that was also that was, I think, the time that open source software was actually really picking up in the world, right? So we had contributors into a lot of the open source projects. And one of the things we did was actually for that university, which was a University of Peradeniya, we actually even donated a lab for open source, if you remember that, you know.
Yes. And would you say those investments from a business perspective, because from a purpose perspective, I can fully see why one would do them. From a business perspective, would you say they paid off?
I don't think from a pure business perspective, if you just was looking at the numbers, I don't think it would have paid off, right? Because it didn't really make sense, you know, having some of the bandwidth of our teams working there. But I think overall, from an industry perspective and being able to give people, you know, ability to work on these things, you know, I think, you know, it paid off. And some of the things we may not even know, right? Some of those influences that had happened, and maybe they would have gone into other projects, maybe, you know, things that we don't know. But I believe that, you know, that kind of uh, things you do with social uh, in mindset, you should never look at numbers because those will
Hmm.
never make sense. But and a lot of the stuff we do on the uh, uh, we call it CSR, but you will never hear them, you will never see them, because for us, those are um, impactful for the society and the community, and it's not something that you need to think about. Okay, what is the impact that you would get? But I think the impact that you're doing it and maybe spreading that, you may create 10 times that impact in those communities and societies.
And it's interesting because that conversation happens a lot in HR, right? It's those intangibles that we can't necessarily measure in terms of the ROI of investments. I think some of the uniqueness of the Senate culture was created by enabling employees of the organization to look at those kind of projects and looking at what is the greater good that we can contribute towards rather than just the am I working my 8, 10 hours for a customer and are those hours billable?
Correct. No, 100%. I fully believe in that too, right? Because it's all about, like mentioned, impact you create. And if you really look at one of the things we did for our 20th anniversary and the 25th, we still have not completed all that, is to donate libraries to rural schools. So we felt that, you know, we want to kind of donate 20 schools libraries. This year we will actually do 25. Still in the very early stage, we have not kind of gone close to that. But that's something we want to do, and that's all done by employees. You know, we only provide the funding and the books, but it's all carried out by them. They select the schools, they go and talk with them and stuff like that. And our only thing is that hopefully this will create some meaningful impact in those societies and those communities that we have no intention of taking any credit. It's all about growing those, you know, communities.
So there's opportunities to have those conversations in between. I had totally forgotten it, but when you were talking about the libraries, I remembered. Do you remember where? I think it was a school that we painted. I can't
Yes,
remember where it was, but funnily enough, I can still in my head see those
yeah.
moments when employees started painting each other and just the bonds that were created in that moment of having fun together, doing something outside of work, which, however, contributed positively to society.
Yes, yes, 100%. I think those are the things I think we all remember, right? You know, we don't remember the work we did, but we remember those kind of uh, times and things like that. But I think overall, Tolga, I think I am a strong believer. I think that's what its work is all about. It's about the positive impact that you can actually have by doing this, you know, this kind of work outside of work. I think the purpose of work is, yes, we want to succeed, we want to grow, we want to do all that stuff, but ultimately what you would believe is that the communities and the societies you serve, whether you have improved their lives and their, standard of living, and helping them out. I think that's what I think has been this many years. We have set up a foundation to do that stuff, and constantly, I'm a strong believer in that's what, as leaders, as company builders, that we should actually do.
Those are, I think, fantastic words to wrap the conversation up with. Is what's the purpose of our organization beyond just profit? What enabled you? Because Dinesh, you couldn't have had this mindset, or maybe you did. Did you have this mindset when you started out your career, when you started out hSenid, or is this something
Yeah,
which
so
evolved?
no, I think especially when I was in US, I was always dreaming of coming back to Sri Lanka, right? So that was my only dream, is to come back. And I think my wife takes the credit for that, kind of pushing that faster, so to come back. And so did that. One part of that was, I was always was thinking, I want to spend one third of my time kind of doing these things that actually has an impact on the society. I think, which was something that I strongly believe. And I think, even for us, I think, maybe we have been little privileged, maybe little lucky to do what we are doing, but there's so
Hmm.
much that we can do to uplift the rest of the societies and the communities. So I always had that, but I think very early stage we couldn't do it because we were just growing the company. But once we start coming to a certain level, that we do that, and we do that purely through your own heart. We don't publish it, we don't do press releases, we don't do any of that stuff. That's something I'm very against, kind of for doing press releases and things like that for things that you do in these things, but it's just that real impact that you can do. And I think there's still more we can do. I won't say we have come close to what we can do, but I think we are in the right path, and we have employees who are really taking this. So for me, I think you mentioned very interesting thing at the very beginning about uh, empowering. I think that's something I did from day one. I mean, we have, from day one, we have said that, okay, mistakes are learning experiences. So as long as you don't do it two, three, four times, but take those as learning experience. We don't kind of I mean, we have had, I mean, recently also, we had a employee, some of our restaurant technology, that he had made a mistake and sent the goods to a completely another part of the US, and he said, I'm sorry I did that. I said, that's fine, as long as we actually check on these things. Let's get the customer right, and then we work through the other parts of that. So I think for me, that's what it is, because if you really look at, nobody intends to do something as, purposely by mistake, right? You don't do that, you don't try to do that. And when that's why it's called a mistake, right? It's called a mistake or something like that, because one is you didn't have the skill or the competency to do that, or you genuinely had something. So if you can empathize that, if you can have that empathy and being able to look at that and work with them. Not everybody works out, and that also I think we have to qualify that. But majority are done on that basis, and if you talk to them and work with them, and they will be uh, people that work with you for years. If you do that kind of have that empathy. I think empathetic leadership is what is needed right now, and with this such a fast moving space, and lot of us need to play that role to kind of build the next generation of leaders who are more empathetic and look at society as a whole rather than just looking at your own personal or your own company. I think as a society, we need to be more responsible for that.
And that's beautiful. There is a huge amount of work going into identifying these more purpose-driven organizations. There has always been, I guess, that assumption that you're either driven for success, business success, shareholder value maximization, or you're more of an NGO kind of organization. And I think the more we look, the more evidence we find that organizations can truly be purpose driven organizations who take shareholder maximization as one of their guiding principles for sure, because at the end of the day, they are private businesses, but as well take that contribution to a better world, may it be from an environmental standpoint or a societal change standpoint, into consideration of how they do business. And it's beautiful to hear, Dinesh, that you've been successful in doing that for the last 26 years. And while I know I would love to keep this conversation going, we do have to find an end. And the way we end these podcasts is always by asking our guests um, with a statement and then asking you to end that statement. And the statement is, if I drop my armor, and if you can end that sentence for us.
Yeah, if I drop my armor, I would not be different from what I am today.
Okay, so it's about that authenticity.
Yes,
Dinesh,
I think for me that is the most important thing. We should not be two-faced in anything. Right? We must be genuine. We must have that authenticity, genuinity in you.
and that allows us to do exactly what you described, somewhere in between. If we know who we are, we can adapt to the situation, approach it with different leadership styles, and taking that empathetic ear to look at what's the best for everyone involved. Thank you so much, Dinesh, for this conversation. Really appreciated it.
Yeah, most
And
welcome, Tolga, and really loved it. And like I said to you beginning before we start, I'm not prepared. There was nothing. I just come and talk my mind off with you. So thank you so much.
thank you.